Here's my MGC Square-1. It turns just as usual and it feels just as usual, but it's actually maglev. Don't believe me? Here's the proof. It is in fact maglev. So the concept of using maglev instead of springs came out several years ago by Chris Tran. But more recently, companies are starting to mass produce maglev cubes. So yeah, pretty cool technology, but I always wondered what happens if you put it inside of a square one. There's only one screw. So instead of needing 12 magnets, all you need is 2 opposing magnets. So this mod seems simple enough to do, so let's see how I did it. I guess a brief warning before this video starts. If you want to mod your own cube, I recommend watching the whole video first before modding anything. Even though this mod is pretty easy to reverse, you could accidentally damage your cube if you're not careful, so just be very cautious. First off, let's get into my old MGC Square-1. So there's this part, which is just the nut. But now here is the part where we want to put the maglev in. You want it to replace the spring, so it goes in between the screw head and the slice. However, as you can see, there's this huge plastic thing here, which holds the screw in as well as the nut, which pretty much blocks any place to put maglev. So the magnets I used were from the MOU maglev kit, and these are the only one I think that are available on the Cubicle. And as you can see, it definitely can't fit in this gap. So I needed some way to get all this plastic out of the way so I could put this magnet in. So that's the first part of the modification, just getting rid of that plastic part. For this part, you can use a lot of different tools. I think it's easiest to just use some pliers. Maybe also nail clippers work, or a Dremel. But I think something like this is easiest. And this mod is actually pretty easy to do. Just take these pliers, put them on the inside of the cube like this, and then pry it out. That way you can kind of clear out this plastic space here. It won't really come in one piece, but if you keep prying at it bit by bit, it should become pretty close to flush. So on my outer Square-1, this is what came out pretty much. Just a plastic piece around the screw. And as you can see, it's not flush, so I have to use the pliers a bit more inside to make it a bit more smooth. So that's how I first got the maglev to work, by first getting off this part and then inserting the maglev. Alright, so here's my Maglev Square-1, and let me show you what it's like. It's a bit dirty, but here's my attempt pretty much of getting the plastic part off. As you can see, it's not perfect, it's not flush. There's still like some plastic parts here, which you can make more smooth. However, it's, I think, good enough and it works for my cube. So you can see the main idea, just get that whole plastic piece off so there's actually space to fit the maglev. Now onto the screw. I removed the washer and the spring completely because they're not necessary. Then for the maglev, again, these are magnets from the MOU kit. So first off, I put one magnet onto the screw like this. Then you have the second ring magnet. Find where it sticks onto this ring magnet and then flip it over and then insert it through the screw. And you can see how this maglev works pretty much. It's like a spring because when you put force here, it forces back. Then all of this goes in like this. And you can see it in action. So there is one thing that's a bit off. So when the maglev's in the cube, it's a bit different in a few ways. Let me just show this on my other maglev cube. So this one's maglev, this one's not. The screw is really deep inside this cube, as you can see. But on this cube, it's pretty close to the outside actually. But as you can see, the tensions are pretty much exactly the same. And the reason why this screw is so deep and this one's not is because the maglev kind of acts as a big washer and it kind of shortens the length of the screw. So that means you can have the screw a bit looser, quote unquote, without the cube actually being too loose. Which is actually a pretty good thing because on this cube you have to screw it a ton before it actually gets in fully. But this one you only have to screw in a little bit and it's a lot easier to take apart, reassemble, and tension. Another thing you might realize here is the maglev looks a bit off. Like the ring magnets are actually not parallel with each other and they're kind of like slanted. And the reason why it's like this is because these magnets are repelling. So basically they want to be far apart from each other as possible. So pretty much if they can go to the side and be far apart with each other, they will, which ends up with kind of slanted magnets. So I wanted to fix this problem by making them more aligned, but it was really difficult because they always wanted to separate. So I need to create some barrier here that forces them to be aligned. But creating a barrier there is pretty difficult, I thought. But the answer is actually pretty simple. So here's my other version of this maglev mod. As you can see, I take off a good chunk of this plastic portion, but I leave one of the plastic rings on like this. So let's put the screw on and see what happens. As you can see, when you put this fully on, the magnets are pretty much flush on top of each other. And that's just because this plastic part just keeps them in place. So pretty much this solves my problem. However, with this mod, I ran into a new problem. Because the magnets are head-on with each other, the repelling force is really strong. Which pretty much makes this act like a really strong spring. As you can see, not too much flex allowed with the cube. And it becomes slower. And finally, the screw doesn't really go too deep because it's kind of forced out by this head-on magnet. As you can see from this other side, you can barely see the screw, and the screw's barely inside this nut. Which leads to another problem, because the screw's not really inside the cube too well. It's really easy to strip, or for the screw to just come off, because the magnet repelling is just too strong, and it kind of forces the cube to fall apart, which I learned the hard way when I got a huge pop on this puzzle. So even though I thought this solution was better to have the magnets head on, it seems like it makes it too tight, too slow, and I don't really like it that much. For that reason, I went back to the misaligned magnets for the Maglev, and that seemed to be the better option. However, if you do want something stronger for the springs or the Maglev, you might want to try this a little bit and play around with it. And if you do, I recommend using some tool like a Dremel to go deeper into the cube. That way the screw gets more space to go deeper in the cube so it doesn't strip as much. Alright, so I pretty much showed you how Maglev works, how to do the mod, how to get the ring magnets, and how to get them in. But what's the result? Here's the first Maglev Square-1 I made. Before I Magleved it, it was pretty slow, almost sluggish, and it wasn't too enjoyable to solve. But after I added the Maglev with the misaligned magnets like this, the cube just suddenly became super fast actually. It's hard to really tell through the camera, but it's a lot faster than it was before. And here's the slice. It's pretty easy to see there, it's pretty fast compared to the spring one. This one has more lube in it, but either way you can tell this one is crazy fast. Now a common question I got is that the screw goes through the slice, but how do the layers, the unity layers, how are their speeds affected? In theory, since the screw doesn't go between these layers shouldn't really be affected at all. However, from my experience, I feel like when the slice is faster, the unity layers feel faster as well. So I'm not sure if this is the Maglev somehow affecting the unity layers, or just one fast layer making everything else seem fast. But the unity layers feel really fast as well. Almost to the point it's uncontrollable, but there is some benefits to it because I can spam SPS so much better. A con, however, is stability seems to have gotten a bit worse. Even though it's so fast, I'm starting to get a lot of lockups. So if I don't turn too accurately, it doesn't pop, but there are some pretty nasty lockups that could happen. To try to fix this, I did add magnets to the unity layers to make them a bit stronger, but it still wasn't perfect. The unity layers, even though they have better magnets, it's still a bit unstable. Another thing is I tried to tighten it, which is pretty tough on this cube, because from what I said before, the magnets, when they're super close, they really don't like to be next to each other. So if you make it tighter or screw it in more, the Maglev magnets, I believe, get exponentially stronger. So you can't keep these cubes too tight. So you have to find that in between where the Maglev is keeping the cube fast, which I think is a plus, but also keeping it pretty stable and not too tight feeling. Like I mentioned, the second version of this cube, I kept 1/2 of this plastic part and had the magnets head on. But for me, that made the cube way too slow, way too tight. And again, it kind of stripped a little bit, so I didn't like that mod at all. So I did this mod once again on my other cube, and that one turned out a lot better actually. I did the same exact thing, no changes, but just added a bit heavier lube in the slice, just to keep it a bit slower, and it worked. That cube is again pretty fast, so I can spam SPS on it pretty well. But because of the different lubricants I used on it, it made it more controllable, and it gave the cube a pretty nice balance. There is another way to Maglev the Square-1 also, without doing the mod that takes off the plastic in the core. So the way you do that is instead of taking the plastic part out, you just get a smaller magnet. I don't think these are available on the Cubicle, but I'll put a link in the description for how to get them. They're pretty much smaller ring magnets that you can fit in between these plastic pieces, so there's no mod necessary. However, I think they're a bit more expensive, so it's up to you if you want to do the mod. I also showed a picture of someone else who had done this mod before. Apparently they said it's pretty good and it's their main, so I think that mod also works pretty well. But unfortunately I don't have those magnets and this is all I have experience with. And it's actually not too bad. I think this mod also works pretty well. So what are the benefits of Maglev? For me, I'm not really too sure what is Maglev and what's placebo. Like the corner cutting on these cubes seem pretty similar with springs, so I don't think it changes that much. The speed gets a lot faster, but that's kind of because they act kind of like weak springs, and it gets a bit unstable, again because it acts like weak springs. But if you put the magnets head on, they act like stronger springs, and the Square-1 becomes a lot slower and more stable. One final thing is that with the Maglev, there's no spring noise, so that's one plus about this mod. So I'm really not sure how worth it this mod is. I'm not sure if a Maglev cube is going to be my main. However, this cube is definitely not bad at all. I think it has a lot of pluses. It has some instability issues, but that can be fixed with stronger magnets and better turning. So we'll see if this mod becomes my main. And honestly, it's pretty close, and I'm really enjoying the feel of the Maglev cube. It's quite different, it's a lot faster, but it needs a lot of playing around with setup to make sure it's controllable with its speed. To end this video off, I'll be doing an average with a Maglev Square-1 and a spring Square-1. Maybe it won't be too helpful, but you can at least tell a bit of the difference between the two during an actual solve.